Well, I'm pleased to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity when you've been through a tragedy, a very difficult experience, a kind of life's journey, and think you've maybe learned some things from it. It's at least therapeutic to be able to share that with other people who are in a position actually to make a difference. I don't have any great expertise in mental health. I'm really coming here in the role of a family member of someone who committed serious harm, who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and to talk a little bit about the family member's journey and how it might collide with the work that you do. I guess I shouldn't have used the word collide because that's not what we're looking at, but I'm afraid probably there are collisions. I can imagine families making a long trip here and coming through and feeling a whole built-up helplessness over a lifetime of being able to help their loved one, and then interacting with all of you and still feeling helpless. I think the provider institutions and families, especially under the kind of circumstances that we have here, are almost set up a little bit for conflict. And yet there's a large body of research that really shows family interactions have a positive effect on treatment outcomes. And so I guess my hope here with this story, and it's really one family story. Every person with mental illness is different, obviously, because they're a person first. Every family is different. Every journey is different. But my hope is that perhaps it'll create some sense of sensitivity to the families that you might see. I'd also like, if possible, if it doesn't bog us down too much, to make this talk a little bit interactive. So there'll be points where I'll kind of invite your opinion on things. But in the meantime, I'm just going to launch into the story and invite you, if you do have a question, feel free to ask it. Kind of stick with the story and the timeline of the story. Hopefully we can get through the entire story, and then maybe at the end we'll have some time to talk as well. From the time I was a child, I always had a sense that my brother was different. And mostly I thought he was different in a good way. Ted is 7.5 years older than I am. So even in early elementary school, I thought of my brother as unusually brilliant. He actually graduated from high school 2 years early at the age of 15. He was the only person I know, at least at that point, who went from our working class community on the southwest side of Chicago on a full ride scholarship to Harvard University at the age of 15, no less. I recall there was a time when he was in high school, maybe only 14 years old, 13, 14 years old, where a guidance counselor had given him an IQ test. And I don't have to explain to you what the number 165 means when it comes to IQ. Ted was like off the charts. He was extremely brilliant. If there was the same kind of celebrity for mathematics as there is for basketball, Ted would have been as famous as Michael Jordan maybe at some point in his life. He, even in graduate school, before he had gotten his PhD, he had published some original mathematical research, some that his teachers thought was remarkable and showed amazing promise. He got a tenure-track job at the University of California at Berkeley, again, an elite institution by the time he was in his early 20s. Yet even when I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old, I recall asking my mom one day, "Mom, what's wrong with Teddy?" And Mom said, "Well, David, what do you mean? There's nothing wrong with your brother. What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, Mom, I have lots of friends, and Teddy doesn't seem to have friends. Why is that?" And she said, "Well, I think it was a healthy response from a parent to ask this kind of question, healthy answer for a child to receive." She said, "Well, David, the world is a big place. It's made of a lot of different kinds of people. Not everybody has to be the same. You're sociable, you like people, people like you, that's wonderful. Teddy is more, he likes to be by himself, he likes to read a lot, he likes to work on things. That's fine too. It takes a lot of different kinds of people to make a world." But I think even at that early stage, Mom realized that maybe I wasn't quite satisfied with that answer. I remember pressing her and said, well, Mom, sometimes it seems like he doesn't like people. And at that point, she sat me down on a couch in our house, I remember, because she always used to use this couch to read me stories. It was kind of Mom's way of teaching me about many things. But at this point, she wanted to tell me about something that had happened before I was born. And she said, Dave, when your brother was 9 months old, just a little baby, he got sick, and we had to take him to the hospital. And in those days, it would probably be different now, but in those days, hospitals weren't very friendly to families. So Teddy was only 9 months old, he was in the hospital, and we were only allowed to visit 3 times a week for 2 hours. And after 2 weeks, when we finally came to bring Teddy home, something was changed. He was very different. He didn't smile anymore. He didn't make eye contact. And it was the first time she ever used for me the word trauma. She said, you know, your brother had a trauma. It was like a scar. He probably doesn't even remember what happened because he was so young. But Teddy doesn't trust people. Maybe it was because he felt we had abandoned him in the hospital. And I remember her telling me something that haunted me. You can imagine years later, she said, David, don't ever abandon your brother because that's what he fears the most. Now that was Mom's narrative. It was her way of understanding, and as time went on, when Ted would act a little strangely, or he would isolate himself, or seem not to trust people, you know, that sort of narrative resurfaced. It was the hospital experience. I think we know that the causes of mental illness are complex. They may be genetic, there may be environmental triggers. But this was the only way my mom could sort of give a meaning and a shape to that story. It was the way she understood why her elder son was different. But again, different for the most part in a positive way. True, he didn't have friends, but he was very successful. He was never in trouble. He was a good kid. I guess the next sort of marker on this family journey would be when Ted was at Berkeley teaching. And without any discussion with the family, I remember one spring our mom and dad got a letter from Ted, and he said, you're probably going to hate me for this, but I've decided to quit my job. And it was a long letter. Ted was much more comfortable with writing things down than when, discussing something face to face. But he said he'd thought about it a lot, and he realized that technology, which many of us celebrate, which, especially at that time was, just people didn't think about the environment so much, people had a kind of uncritical admiration for the wonders of technology. Well, Ted had come to the conclusion that all of that was completely wrong, and that there were so many unintended consequences, that it involved environmental damage, but a loss of freedom. And then he said, and furthermore, I've come to the conclusion that since a lot of technology is based on mathematics, I'm actually doing harm to the world by doing mathematics. I've decided to quit my job. But more than quitting his job, he said that he wanted to get as far away from technology as he could. He wanted to go out and live in the woods. He wanted to try to live off the land. Our family had always loved camping and things like this, but this seemed kind of extreme and surprising. And Ted had gone to Harvard and gone, marvelous education, and all of a sudden everything's changing, and he's got this view of technology, and he's going to go off and live in the woods. Now, mind you, the time was late 60s. I mean, some of you are as old as I am. I think Time magazine had maybe a cover story on dropping out. There was a kind of fad that, people would, go off and, live in nature or live a pure kind of life. And so, actually, I thought this was really cool. I mean, I'd always looked up to Ted. I thought this was wonderful. Our parents didn't feel the same way. And, probably some of the reason was, wow, they'd invested so much and had such high hopes for their child. But I think it was more than that. I think there was this lingering worry. And I remember Mom saying to me, Dave, I don't think this is really about technology. I'm afraid your brother just can't cope. He doesn't know how to accept people or be accepted by people. I'm afraid he's running away from a world that he doesn't really know how to deal with. Um, Things went along fairly normally. I remember I had visited Ted out in the woods a number of times. You know, he seemed to be fairly happy. He seemed to tell me enthusiastically about things were going on. We'd have these conversations about technology, and you know, I was a good listener. I could see his point of view. Sometimes I thought it was kind of extreme, and you know, when I'd give like a sort of a little counter pushback on some of this ideology of Ted's, he'd get kind of upset, you know, so I kind of learned over time, well, maybe that's a subject, you know, he doesn't want to talk about too much, or at least doesn't want to debate with his younger brother. In about, when would this have been? I guess it would have been in the early 1970s. Something fairly shocking happened. At that point, I was teaching school in the state of Iowa, and my parents sent me this letter, and it enclosed a letter from my brother. Very long letter. It was 23 pages long. Ted, at this point, had been out in the woods 5 or 6 years. But this, again, came out of the blue without any kind of warning. I'd never had any sort of conversation with Ted about this. But the letter started basically as follows. I have been unhappy all my life. I've been really miserable. I've never understood why. But now I've had lots of time to think about it, and I've finally figured it out. I'm unhappy because you never loved me. And then it went on for the next 20 pages explaining why, you know, they shouldn't have yelled at him here, or they shouldn't have said this or that, things that scarred him. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, what, has Ted lost his mind? I mean, what's going on here? I mean, we grew up in the same family. Our parents were loving. They cared about us both. You know, he's got a very distorted memories of things that happened in our family. I think those of you who are listening to this story as, you know, sort of professionals, you're beginning to see some symptomology of mental illness. There is this, you know, fixed belief system. There's the isolation that the person is beginning to have, and then this sort of paranoid ideation about the family. You know, at the time, I just thought, well, Ted's kind of, you know, he's kind of emotionally intense. He lives a lot by himself. He doesn't have anybody to talk to. You know, maybe he's just gotten kind of wound up in his thoughts. So I wrote him a letter. I said, oh, Ted, you know, you've deeply hurt Mom and Dad. You should write to them and let them know that you really didn't mean it. You know they love you. And over the next 3 or 4 months, as we exchanged letters back and forth, I came to the conclusion that, no, Ted hadn't just lost his temper. He'd actually had a fixed belief system that our parents were cold and unloving parents. They pushed him academically because they wanted him to be a star, but they never cared about his happiness. And it was very puzzling to me. It was like no kind of counter evidence would count for Ted. Ted would always have a way. He was so brilliant to spin it into something other than what it appeared to me to be. For a number of years, I became kind of the liaison between Mom and Dad and Ted. Every time I'd see Mom and Dad, they'd say, have you seen Ted? Have you heard from Ted? Is he okay? And then sort of endless family discussions. Did we do something wrong? Is there some way we could show him that we really love him? I remember Dad writing a letter, like an apology for some things that he thought he had not done so well. And then the response came back, see, you finally admit that you did all these bad things. And there was no understanding that, gee, my father, our father, was trying to build a bridge, trying to reestablish a relationship, but it all got kind of spun into this sort of paranoid ideation. Around this time, something wonderful happened to me. There was a girl I'd met in 7th grade by the name of Linda, and when she was, you know, at that age I thought she was pretty cool, but by the time I was 16 or 17, I thought she was way cool, and I kind of developed a crush on Linda. Unfortunately, it wasn't entirely reciprocal, well, suffice to say, it was now 20 years after high school, and call it a long courtship, but Linda had finally said yes. So Linda and I were going to be married. It was going to be the happiest day of my life. And I remember as we were arranging for the wedding, I thought, you know, maybe I could invite Ted to the wedding. Maybe he'll come. You know, maybe this day of joy for Linda and me will be an opportunity for our family to be together. It'll be a day of joy for me and Linda, but a moment of reconciliation. Ted will understand that we really love him, we accept him, we want him to be part of the family. So I sent Ted a letter. I actually asked him to be my best man, and I couldn't imagine Ted making a toast or doing all the things the best man is supposed to. That didn't matter. Just to have him there would have been so meaningful to me. And I guess I really wasn't prepared for what happened. The letter I got back was 17 pages long. It began with 2 big words, underlined, capital letters, multiple exclamation points, "You fool." And he went on to explain to me why Linda, whom, by the way, he'd never met, was actually not in love with me. She was a bad person. My life was going to be ruined. And by the time he got to the 16th or 17th page, he was saying, well, you know, I know you don't listen to me. I know how stubborn you are. This relationship is too painful for me. David, let's just call it quits. We're not brothers anymore. Don't communicate with me. It's all over. And I'm reading this letter, and you know, part of me is feeling angry, like he's hurt Mom and Dad terribly. He's wounded them. But what right does he have to, you know, attack this woman he's never met, the woman I love? And, you know, I'm feeling angry, but then another part of me is feeling very, very sad and almost scared. It's like Ted has no one. I mean, he's living out in the woods. I was like his most important human contact. Now that's gone. Part of me is hearing Mom's old narrative, you know. Does he feel abandoned? Does he feel, because I love Linda, I can't love him? Very strange. He said to me that if, you know, I would write to him, I shouldn't bother because he would just throw my letters into the fire unread. It didn't entirely hold. Our father passed away a few years later. I did write to him. He attempted to reestablish some contact with Mom. He still said he didn't want to talk with me anymore. And at one point he sent a letter to Mom that was just really over the top. In other words, like the handwriting was irregular. There were strongly, like he said that when he got letters from her, he was afraid they could kill him because his heart would stop beating. Sometimes he said for almost a minute, which probably is biologically impossible. He couldn't sleep for days. And so he was demanding that Mom not write to him anymore. I remember showing one of these letters to Linda. She was looking at the letter, and I remember her looking up. Talk about the family journey, the sort of learning curve. And mind you, I had psychology courses in college, but Linda's looking up from the letter, and she says, David, you know your brother's sick. I mean, he's mentally ill. You know that, don't you? And my first reaction was to say, well, you don't understand. Ted's very unique. He thinks very differently. He's very smart, and you know, he's by himself a lot. And she said, no, David, read this. People who are healthy in their minds don't think this way. We got to try to get him some help. Maybe it took that person from sort of outside the family. It's like we'd adapted the whole family dynamic to the ways in which Ted was different. And here it is, so many years later, so much adaptation later, it's like we've gone way out on a limb. And Linda, who's a little bit more objective, can look at this and say, look, your brother's ill. And she persuaded me at that time to take some of Ted's letters to a psychiatrist in Schenectady. And I remember in the first meeting, the psychiatrist said, you know, David, reading these letters, I mean, it's very clear that your brother is very, very seriously ill. I can't give a diagnosis just based on some letters. It takes more than that, but certainly he's very, very paranoid. There are aspects, symptomology here that would be consistent with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. And of course my question is, well, what can we do? How can we get help? And of course, I didn't know about the McNaughton rule. I didn't know about the legalities that, you know, try to balance civil rights, the autonomy of individuals and respecting their choices against, you know, the need of society to protect itself or to protect people who might want to harm themselves. And so he explained what would be required. I mean, Ted didn't think his problems were in his mind. He thought his problems were in his family or in the world or in technology. The last thing he thought was that the problems were in that wonderful brain of his. He wasn't going to seek treatment. And he basically explained to us, look, you'd have to go to a court in Helena, Montana, the county where he lives. You'd have to present legal evidence that would show that he's a danger to himself or others. That itself could be traumatic for your brother. There's a fight or flight syndrome. He had gotten as far away from his stressors, thinking that they were external. This would be very difficult, and it might not be successful. What evidence do you have that your brother is a threat to himself or others? And I said, well, I've always had this fear that maybe someday Ted would hurt himself. And he explained that, imminent danger, imminent threat, just a vague fear that Ted might hurt himself really wouldn't have any legal traction. I remember we actually, at that point, called, in some of his letters, Ted had talked about his heart and how it would stop beating. He'd actually gone to see a cardiologist in Helena, Montana, and mentioned the name of the cardiologist. So as Linda, I, and the psychiatrist are kind of strategizing, we thought maybe we could talk to her, maybe she could use her influence to get him into treatment. We tried a couple of times, but her pledge of confidentiality is to her patient, not to her patient's family. She listened. I sent some of Ted's letters, made a few follow-up calls, and at some point I just didn't hear back from her. And I don't think she understood or knew very much about mental illness. At that point it was almost like, well, we just have to hope for the best, And some feeling that Ted had been so closely bonded to our family, he'd come back to us someday. At least that was the hope. About 2 years later, I got a letter from Ted. Very simple, short letter. He said, I desperately need $1,000. I'll pay you back later, but I desperately need $1,000. I was worried about whatever that desperation might be. I thought it might be a health problem. I thought it might be hunger. On the positive side, I thought maybe he will seek treatment. And I thought, well, this is some way I could prove to him that I love him. I'm not going to ask questions. I'm not going to make him sign. I talked with Linda. Yeah, we sent him a check for $1,000. A few months later, another letter came. This will be the last request, he said, but now I need $2,000. So we sent him $2,000. It was like the only way we had to prove that we loved him, unconditional love. A couple of years later, I got home from work one day. At this point, I was working at a youth shelter on the south end of Albany, Equinox, and here I was helping troubled kids and their families. And I felt really good about the work, although there was a fair amount of crisis and stress involved in it, but nothing to prepare me for what was going to come next. I remember I was walking up the driveway, and Linda and I have been married for 5 years now. I can kind of read her face, and I'm thinking, as I look at her face looking out the kitchen window, uh-oh, what did I do? She did not look happy, and I came in the door, and sure enough, she says, David, we have to talk. And at that point, I was sure I was in trouble. She leads me down the hallway to our living room and kind of sits me down on the couch. And she puts her hand on my knee, and she says, now, David, don't get angry at me. All of a sudden, I thought, okay, what did she do? And I imagine, maybe she ran up the MasterCard bill, put a dent in the car, anything. I'm all ready to forgive her. And then she says something that absolutely takes my breath away. She said, David, has it ever occurred to you, even as a remote possibility, that this Unabomber that everybody's talking about might be your brother? And wow, my jaw hit the floor. I wasn't prepared for that. I said immediately, Ted has never been violent. I can't remember one time when he'd been violent. And then she pointed out some possible coincidences that the Unabomber was thought to come from Chicago since the first bombs had been planted there. And of course, both of our families had come from Chicago. There had been a subsequent bomb at a student center at the University of California at Berkeley, where Ted had once been a professor. But I think the thing that tipped Linda to the point where she actually sort of was going to approach me was news that the Unabomber had sent a manifesto, a long essay to the New York Times and the Washington Post in which he argued, explained that he was sending these bombs, planting these bombs in a protest against modern technology. So Linda's thinking, okay, let's see, Chicago, Berkeley, anti-technology, maybe it's just coincidence, but maybe these are pieces of a puzzle that add up to your brother. And I got to admit, talk about denial, I was very resistant at the time. I'm saying, look, there's a lot of radical environmentalists. Ted has never been violent. This is all a coincidence. And Linda at that point extracted me from a promise. And the promise was that if the manifesto were ever published, I would get a copy of it, read it, and give her an honest opinion about whether it could be my brother's writing. Well, it was a couple weeks later that the manifesto was published. I remember the first time that I got to read it was actually online. There had been just the first 6 pages posted somewhere on the internet. And I remember sitting looking at the screen, and Linda was kind of sitting kitty corner to me. But I realized very quickly she wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at my face. She didn't know Ted. She knew my face would tell her more than the words on the screen. And I was all set to turn to her and say, look how silly you've been. I know Ted. I know how he writes. I know how he thinks it's not him. And instead, as I began to read, I got a kind of sinking feeling. I realized I couldn't say that in good faith to my wife. And at one point, she says, well, David, do you think it could be your brother? And I said, look, hon, I'll be honest with you. Some parts do sound like Ted. Other parts I really can't connect with. Maybe, and here I was trying to be reassuring, I said, maybe there's 1 chance in 1,000 that Ted wrote this. And then Linda got kind of thoughtful, and she said, David, 1 chance in 1,000 that your brother is this serial murderer? Don't you think we need to find the truth? As most of you probably remember, I mean, the Unabomber was the most wanted person in America at that point, probably in the world. Over a period of 16 years, he had mailed or placed in public places. Over a period of 17 years, he'd placed 16 bombs. A number of people had been injured, some seriously. 3 people at this point had been killed. Huge, if you watched America's Most Wanted or any of these programs, was help us find the Unabomber, and here I am suddenly confronting the possibility that it could be my only brother, a family member, somebody I love and somebody I've been very, very worried about. For the next couple of weeks, Linda and I kind of decided we'd try to investigate on our own. Linda teaches philosophy. She's really smart. I must be attracted to smart people. And I was an English major. So we had the manifesto there. It was 78 pages long. And over the years, I'd saved many of my brother's letters. I had almost 100 of them saved. And so we would sit down every night. Linda would come back from college, the college where she taught. I would come back from my work at the youth shelter. We'd have dinner, go to our living room. Instead of having a conversation or read a book, here we would sit there combing through the manifesto day after day, comparing, looking for similarities and differences in Ted's letters. For me, it was like a roller coaster because some days I'd be sitting there and I'd just suddenly think, well, this is crazy. What am I doing? My brother, the Unabomber, come on. Am I crazy to even think such a thing? I think, this is projection. I've been worried about my brother. See, that psychology course I took in college had some usefulness to me. This is projection. I've been worried about my brother, and Linda's planted this germ of suspicion, and I'm seeing something that I'm afraid to see, and that's why I'm seeing this. And then, the next night I might be reading some passage in the manifesto, and all of a sudden I'd get confused and think it was one of Ted's letters, and it would be almost like I could hear his voice there, and I'd say to myself, am I in denial, Am I refusing to see what would be obvious if I would just allow myself to see it? One night I remember, one morning I woke up, and it's strange in a sense. It's almost like it's sort of the revelation in a sense came in a dream. I remember waking up one morning, Saturday morning, so I slept in a little bit late, and I'm lying there in bed and thinking, gee, that's the worst nightmare I've ever had in my life. And then as the cobwebs started to melt, I sort of woke up. I realized it's not a nightmare. I'm literally considering the possibility that my brother is public enemy number one. I remember walking to the breakfast table. Linda had gotten up a little bit earlier. She was eating a bowl of cornflakes, and I just caught her eye, and just through this fog of despair, I said to her, you know, I think there's a 50-50 chance that it's Ted. Linda knew what it cost me to say that. This is the first time I'd really come close to validating her suspicion. And you can imagine how upset she was at this point. You know, we had the obvious question, is Ted the Unabomber? But then there's this other whole question that begins to dawn for us is, like, what do we do with this? This is a man who's killed 3 people. If it is Ted, aren't we obligated morally to stop him from doing that? On the other hand, this is my brother, you know, the person I see as fragile, damaged, the person whom my mother said to me, don't ever abandon. And you know, I'd been a lifelong opponent of the death penalty. I never imagined that I would have like a personal confrontation like with a capital punishment. And here we wanted to make a choice that would save lives, and yet, you know, there was no life-affirming choice here. If we do nothing, one might wake up some morning and realize, hey, somebody else got killed, and they died because we had failed to act. You know, we'd have to go through the rest of our lives with the blood of an innocent person on our hands. I mean, that's unthinkable. Linda's a professor who teaches courses in ethics. I'm working with young kids and trying to be a good role model and talk to them you know, about the dangers of risky behavior and violence. And of course, the other horn of this dilemma is the realization if we turn Ted in, if he is the Unabomber, there's a fair likelihood, maybe even a high likelihood, that at some point he's going to be executed. You know, I thought about, you know, the impact on Ted, obviously. At one point when he was out there in the wilderness and before I told him about Linda, he'd written to me and said, David, I want you to know, and this was uncharacteristic for Ted. He was not a very emotional or at least expressive person. He said, I want you to know that if something ever happens to me, you're the only person I've ever loved. So what would it be like for this paranoid guy with one friend in the world, his little brother, to be turned in by his little brother? It would be like the elimination of hope from his universe. I thought of the guilt I would carry if my brother actually got executed. But, you know, more than Ted and me, guess who I thought about? I thought about Mom. At this point, she was a 79-year-old widow. She'd worried for years and years and years about her elder son. Believe me, Mom's worst nightmare about what could be wrong with Ted didn't come close, you know, to the suspicion we were struggling with. Maybe he is a serial murderer. I'm thinking, wow, man, if Mom gets wind of this, if this, you know, comes to something, she can't survive. She won't sleep. Her happiness will end. She'll probably have a heart attack or a stroke. I could lose my brother to the legal system. I could lose my mother, you know, to the stress of all of this. It was like the end of our lives as a family. Talk about double binds, right? I mean, it's like, wow. I remember, you know, as Linda and I were struggling with the suspicion of, you know, like this question of what do we do with this, you know, we got to the end of that first day, and I think I was just so, I think both of us were just exhausted. It was like we were chasing our tails. It's like we couldn't work our way quite out of or through this dilemma. And as we're lying there in bed that night, kind of with everything unresolved, we kind of hoped, well, maybe we'll sleep on this. Maybe in the morning we'll wake up with clearer minds. We'll be able to take another approach at it. And as I'm lying there, another sort of question dawns in my mind, and the question is, who is my brother? Like, I thought I knew who he was. I mean, I'm puzzled by his behavior, but is he evil? Did I grow up with evil in my own family? How could I not see that? You know, how could I be blinded to it? And I began sort of talking out loud, thinking out loud to Linda, sharing with her some memories from my life and childhood. And I was again, searching for this question, who is my brother? And I told her this one story that had a very powerful effect on her. I told her that when I was, I think it was about 2.5, 3 years old, our family moved from this inner city apartment in Chicago out to a home in the suburbs. It was our first single family home. It was the first time I had a backyard that I could play around in as a little kid. And I remember I used to, with delight, push my way out through the screen door we had in the back and play around in the backyard and talk with other kids, meet other kids. And I was having a ball. The only frustration during that time was that I was so short at the age of 3 that I couldn't quite reach the doorknob to the screen door to open the back door and let myself back inside the house. So it became a kind of daily ritual where I would stand in the back patio and say, "Mom, Dad, Ted, let me in." And sooner or later one of them would come. Until one day, after a few weeks of this, I remember I saw Teddy fiddling with something at the back door. I remember walking up there thinking, what's Teddy doing? And I saw he'd taken this spool of thread from Mom's sewing kit, and he removed this, so he has this bare spool. He'd taken the thread off, and he had a hammer and nail from Dad's tool kit. And he put the spool onto the wooden screen door. He put the nail in the hole, and he hammered it on there. And when he was done, he said, "Dave, see if this works." And all of a sudden, I realized what he'd done. He'd made this little makeshift door handle for me. So he's always a very ingenious person. I mean, at the time, I took it for granted. Ted's big, he's smart, he does nice things for me. That's just the way he is. But here it is, like 42 years later. I'm struggling with this awful suspicion. Is my brother a serial murderer? What should I do about it? And whoa, this memory floats up, from 42 years ago. And as I'm sharing it with Linda, as we are lying in bed there, I hear this little sound, and I kind of look over at Linda's head on the pillow next to mine, and there's just enough light coming through the shades so that, I could see that her face is just flooded with tears. And pretty soon she's sobbing, and we're hugging each other, trying to comfort each other. It's like suddenly, it meant so much to me that, Linda was not just giving me an argument why it could be Ted, but, the immensity of this tragedy, not only for our family, but for all the families affected, had dawned on her. And somehow, mysteriously, the next day when we woke up, we knew we had to take action. I have this question for you. There's the decision, and I won't talk too much about it, to go to law enforcement. But let me ask you this question as professionals. It's a question we asked ourselves. Should we tell Mom what's going on? Or not? I thought in some sense, well, she deserves to know, right? I mean, if you talk about a stakeholder, she's a stakeholder number one maybe here after Ted. But what would you do, or what would you advise somebody to do in this situation? I don't know if there's a right or wrong, but I'm actually interested in your advice or thoughts on it. Yes?
I think we couldn't really tell you what to do, but our role as psychiatrists is to say, what are the risks, what are the benefits, and you'll have to make the decision on that. We can't really advise everyone.
Nice strategy for evading the question. So let me ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Yeah.
Well, I can tell you based on my own experience. I told my mother I was divorced and she had a stroke, which impacted her and almost killed her. So I have an aversion to telling parents such things.
Concern.
Any other thoughts? Yes.
Well, at that point, it was all conjecture. You could let the police investigate, and if they found out there was nothing, you wouldn't have any reason to live upsetting your mother.
Right, she would never have to know, perhaps. Yeah.
I suppose in terms of risks, though, the thing that would be on my mind is if this were to pan out into something substantial, who would she find out about? Who would she find out about it from, and when? And one idea might be that it may be easier for her to have that come from you first than, on the news or however else you might find out about it.
Good point. If she's going to hear this terrible difficult message better from me than from the news media or someone in law enforcement, I would think. Yes?
Not directly applied to this particular situation, but we have a guidance or a law, Tarasoff law that we operate, that if he were to get angry at his own family, your mother, he could have done some harm to them. So as a psychiatrist, if I know this information, that it is my obligation to protect everybody, inform everybody that you are engaged with somebody out there can.
Right. What if, so you're suggesting, what if Ted sent one of these bombs to Mom? Shouldn't she at least take precautions? Wouldn't this have a precautionary value to tell her? Interesting. Yes?
Well, I'm a mother, and even if I was 79 years old, I would want to be able to support my son no matter what he did. So I think she had that right to know so that she could make a choice on what she wants to do with that.
Yeah, if we're really respecting people's choices, don't they need the information? They need to make those choices? So are there limitations to that guiding principle? Maybe so, but I could certainly hear your point. Yes?
I think at this stage, you yourself is not sure. I think you start subjecting her until you have a little bit more information and things like that. Maybe better to do whatever you need to do, and when you are through, then maybe try to make the decision and to tell her in a sort of, before she hears from somebody else.
Right, I'm thinking 50-50, 50-50 is a large possibility that, Mom would have enormous stress without any need to have the enormous stress.
And also you have to take into consideration about her health and
Yeah, she hadn't been in very good health.
cultural background and all that.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Obviously, it is a very stressful psychological conflict to you. I guess if you tell your mom, you are doing the justice, you are telling the truth, and probably there could be some selfish motive too, you will be relieved of this conflict. Maybe it is therapeutic to you. I did tell the truth, so there is no conflict. No doubt, it will be dramatic.
So the principle is if you always tell the truth, then in some sense it's the universe's sort of things. Well, I don't know.
You are going to a lot of stress because you don't know whether to tell or not to tell. So by telling, you are telling the truth. That's good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the conflict is disappearing.
Right.
It's not there anymore.
I sort of think there would still be a lot of internal conflict no matter what, dealing with the consequences of telling the truth. Because then the question would be, what's Mom's opinion about turning Ted in? How do I deal with that? Lots of things. I don't know if there's any way out of the conflict.
No, there is no way out of the
There is
conflict.
no way.
But it's not just you focus, and this, you tell it, it's a wonderful story, the way you tell it, and but it's not just about her and Ted. It's about you and her. And that kind of can get lost in worrying about telling what your suspicions are, as opposed to you're in this horrible situation and having this feeling that you need to do something, and she is your mother, not just Ted.
So you think I need her in her role as mother to help sort of shoulder this burden?
To be a mother.
But there's also this dimension of, like, if I don't tell her too, how does that affect our future relationship? If I've taken actions that she has a deep interest in without her knowledge or consent, how does that affect our relationship going forward? Yeah.
I guess I would have a third person come in who's absolutely sure that that's what the situation is, and have them come and talk to you as a family. You already knowing what's going on. Because then it's not coming from you, and she's not going to be looking at you as the person who...
The one thing that made it very difficult to go to a third person is that this is the Unabomber. There's like $1 million reward. It's like, this is beyond like a family counseling situation. It's like, yeah.
In actual, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in almost any arena that you look at. You can't ship her out to Hawaii on an island. You know, you can't do that. She's going to find out, you know, and
Unless they investigate and find out Ted's innocent, maybe she never has to know anything.
there's going to be stress no matter
Yeah.
what. And I just think if there's a third party that it can do it well, can come in and sit down and talk with the family with the
Yeah.
thought in mind that this is a really bad thing to have to tell them.
It's really helpful for me to hear all this, and to get through the story, we probably should cut it short, you know, this particular discussion short right now. But you can see how complex it is for families, and I think the point, it's not just between her and Ted, it's between me and Mom, and how all these family dynamics take place, and the incredible sort of stress for everyone involved. I didn't tell Mom at that point, and I don't know if it was the right thing to do. Sometime later, actually, way down the line, she had a moment. I think she'd spent a lot of time trying to protect me later on, but she had a moment where she said, "David, I wish you'd told me." Maybe I couldn't bear to tell her. Maybe I had to postpone that moment until it was absolutely necessary. Maybe it was truly my love for my mother. I couldn't bear to inflict this burden on her unless the time came. Maybe I worried about her ability to handle it. I think in many ways I didn't give my mother the credit it turned out she deserved at many points in the story. Anyway, we went to the FBI. I remember, yes?
Did it ever cross your mind, if she said no, what was your responsibility going to be?
It would have certainly complicated the decision making if she said no. You mean no about going to the...
Did it cross your mind at that time?
Yeah.
What if she said no?
Yeah, it certainly crossed my mind. I don't know if I played out all the consequences of that, but it would have made it much more complicated. You know, in some senses, Linda and I were sitting there, and I'm very proud, and as you talk about the family dynamics here, very proud of our relationship. We made a pledge to each other that we'd act together and really try to do the right thing, and we'd really talk it out, and it wasn't just a process that could be done within a couple of days. You know, it's very interesting. We always think of conscience or action sort of located in a sole decision maker, particularly in our sort of individualistic culture. I think the truth of the matter is that, you know, this was not my decision. It was a family decision. It was a joint decision made by two people who had loved each other for a long, long time. And the media, with its brother's narrative and all of that stuff, they cut Linda out completely. It was like she didn't even exist when she was absolutely key to this. And I would make the further point that some of the most important decisions we made are actually made in the context of relationship, either within a family setting or a clinical team setting or as a whole culture, that really relationship and the integrity of relationship is a key to having an authentic process. I remember when Linda and I were in high school, this was like how many years, 20-some years earlier, there had been this story of this woman in New York City who'd been murdered by the name of Kitty Genovese. And there was a whole media cycle about bystander behavior because while she was assaulted over a period of 30 minutes, it turned out that there were something like 29 or 30 witnesses who saw the entire assault and who never called the police. You know, some of those witnesses had said things like, well, I thought they knew each other. Like that would make a difference. I mean, some of the witnesses said, well, I didn't want to get involved. And in some sense, that became the national headline. Mm-hmm. And as Linda and I compared our story to that story, we realized, you know, any one of those 29 witnesses could have said, let somebody else do it. Maybe that was their excuse. Well, there was nobody else. There was nobody who knew Ted well enough to actually take action here. When we finally did go to the authorities, they were skeptical at first. They weren't jumping up and down and blowing whistles. You know, they invited us to a meeting in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks after our first contact. We had 2 full days, and I think by the end of those 2 days, they had brought in someone with some like serious sort of profiling experience who really began to click with what we were saying. And on the second day, I remember they had one of the agents come back into the room with this rural map of Montana, like a topographic, very detailed map of the part of the county where Ted lived. And he said, "David, could you show me where your brother's cabin is?" And believe me, at this point, there's no turning back. The die was cast. Our decision had been made. But I can't tell you how painful it was to go to that map and put my finger down and realize I could be, in effect, sending my brother to his death. A few weeks later, actually they investigated for a couple of months. We were often on the phone with them. I still hadn't told Mom. When I got a call from one of the agents who said, "David, I'm really sorry to have to tell you this. We're at a point in the investigation where your brother's moved to the top of our suspect list, and we really feel like we need to talk with your mother. So do you think you could go to her, tell her what's going on, and perhaps persuade her to meet with us?" So Linda and I decided it would be better if I did that, not that she not be part of it. Heard enough sort of mother-in-law thematics to think, we didn't want to create a lightning rod toward Linda. If Mom was going to get really angry at someone, let it have to be me. So I remember I went to her apartment. She lived at that point about 3 miles from us, and knocked on her door. And Mom opens her door and takes one look at me and says, "David, you look terrible. Did something happen?" And I said, "Mom, I think you better sit down." And probably the years of worry or, a mother's intuition, she just says, "Oh my God, did something happen to Ted? Is he alive?" And I said, "Mom, as far as I know, Ted is in good health, but there's something really difficult I have to tell you. It's going to take a little while to explain. Let's go in. Come on, sit down, and I'll try to explain it to you." Mom sat down in her lazy boy chair, and I'm really too agitated to sit down. I'm kind of pacing the room back and forth and trying to think, is there some way I can deliver this news that doesn't cause her to have a stroke, that doesn't crush her? And I started sort of trying to say, "Well, Mom, have you heard of the Unabomber?" And of course, everybody had heard of the Unabomber. And I pointed out the Unabomber had lived in certain places, and then that Ted had lived in some of these same places. And there was really no protecting her. At some point, the light bulb's going to come, illumination. And Mom is a very bright woman, and within a few minutes, she's just looking at me with this look of horror on her face, and can't believe what she's hearing, and not saying a word. And at that point, I really felt like the intensity of a kind of crisis, because I knew that my mom loved me. I knew that she loved Ted with all her heart. I had no idea how a mother would reconcile the idea that her son is a suspect, the other son has turned him in. The outcome could be serious, even up to an execution. I wasn't sure that Mom would still love me after I told her what I'd done. Remember, she said, "Never abandon your brother." Well, I wasn't just abandoning him. I was handing him over to, an institution that could kill him. It might be a betrayal that she could never forgive. She'd always known her son needed protection. He was fragile. He was different. At any rate, at some point, I just realized I had to kind of lay out all the cards. I was crying a little bit, obviously very upset. And when I got down and I said, "Mom, I've actually taken these suspicions. I've shared them with the FBI, and they're now investigating Ted to see whether he might be responsible." I'll never forget what Mom did next. She's a tiny little woman, under 5 feet tall, so she's more than a foot taller than me, but without saying a word, she just got out of her chair. She walked up to me. She just reached her arms up around my neck and pulled me down. It's a familiar gesture, just so that she could reach my cheek and put a kiss on my cheek. And the first thing she said, "David, I can't imagine what you've been struggling with." I mean, this had to be the most awful, horrific moment of her life, and here she is concerned about my feelings, and I guess parents are sometimes like that. And then the next thing she said was the most healing thing comforting thing I could have heard, at least. She said, "David, I know that you love Ted. I know that you wouldn't do this unless you truly felt that you had to." I still marvel at Mom doing that, and I think if she'd acted very differently, if she'd like yelled at me, if she said, "How could you?" if she threw me out, if she even hit me, all of that would be fairly normal human behavior, a reaction to a serious, severe trauma. You know, maybe it was those years of worry that had prepared Mom in some way, the nightmares or whatever, for the worst when it finally came. But I still marvel at her, you know, her ability to be so focused and so kind to me at that moment. And of course, it was then I realized I hadn't lost Mom's love, and now Linda, Mom, and I would, you know, walk this difficult path together. You know, Mom was about where I had been when Linda had told me, you know, I was like, "But David, you know, he's never been violent, right? I mean, Ted is so sensitive. I mean, we worried about him because he was too sensitive, you know. He loves animals. I can't imagine him doing something violent to hurt, you know, strangers like this. It just doesn't make sense." You see, they're going to investigate. They're going to find out Ted's completely innocent. David, all this is going to go away like a bad dream. So she's trying to comfort me, but at this point, I don't really have a lot of hope left. And it's at this point I have to tell her that the FBI would like to talk to her. At first, she's kind of reluctant. She says, "Well, you know, I don't know anything about this. This is all new to me." And I had to explain that the investigation involved a lot of psychological analysis and looking at the language of letters. And of course, she had many letters from Ted. And I said, you know, they're looking at postmarks too. Maybe a postmark could prove that Ted was in Montana when the Unabomber was someplace else. That would be good. And she said, "Well, David, I trust your judgment. You know, whatever. When do they want to talk to me?" And it was then I had to tell her, "Mom, they're actually outside right now. They want to talk to you now." I think from the law enforcement folks, they didn't want her to contact a lawyer. They didn't want to try to reach Ted. They just wanted to see if they could get in at a moment where they could have an honest conversation with her. And they were very gentle. They were very professional. You know, you sometimes hear about people in law enforcement being very intimidating or using the third degree. That was not their approach. And I think it was to their self-interest. Mom, I know her well enough. She would have tossed him out if they had, you know, tried to strong-arm her. And at one point, one of the agents said, "Well, Mrs. Kaczynski, do you have anything like letters, family photographs, anything that could help us move this case forward, the investigation forward?" And at that point, Mom sent me to her closet where she had this big old footlocker. This is where she had her treasures. So on one side is the David side, and the other side is Ted's side. And I remember dragging this thing out into the middle of the living room floor, swinging open the cover. And here we're talking baby shoes, photograph albums, letters, Ted's papers, some of my trophies from Little League many years later. And so here's Mom down on her knees, you know, handing up, you know, packages of letters. And I remember at one point she picked up this photograph album and opened it up and said, "You know, look, we're a good family. You know, look here, we went camping a lot. Ted caught his first fish here. You know, they were really good kids." You know, as much to say, well, you know what happens when you put together a mom with family photographs? You're going to get stories. But Mom's stories had an agenda, and the agenda was basically to say, you're looking in the wrong place. We'll do anything to help you, but you know, you're not going to find the Unabomber, a serial killer, in a family like ours. And then at one point, she pulled up this little blue book, and she held it up. "Would you like to see this? This is Ted's baby book. It's a diary I kept during the first year of his life." And of course, she's opening that book and showing to the 9-month period, he was in the hospital, just hedging her bets. If, God forbid, Ted's done something horrible, well, it must be because of this hospital trauma. And I just kind of lost it there. I mean, Mom was so brave and advocating for her son and showing, I thought, tremendous courage. Ted was arrested about a week later, maybe it was 10 days later, I don't remember. It was like sudden national news. We didn't find out about it from the FBI. Reporters started calling me at my job. I called Linda at her work. I said, you know, I think something's going on. We better get to Scotia to protect Mom. And so we wound up, the three of us sitting. She hadn't been watching television, but then pretty soon we're sitting on her couch watching the television screen, and the story has broken, you know, after 17 years and 16 bombs and 3 deaths, at long last the FBI has arrested a suspect, and his name is Theodore J. Kaczynski. So, you know, what was this like scarcely whispered secret between me and Linda and then shared with the FBI and finally with Mom? It was like the whole world knew. It was like no way to take it back. And God forbid you're ever in that circumstance and you see that kind of a brand that your family, your good family name is suddenly equated with murder, violence, and madness, the realization that it won't be for the rest of time. It will trigger those kinds of thoughts in people. It won't mean anything good to people. And at some point they had a film clip of Ted being arrested, and you know, he looked absolutely awful. At this point he weighed 122 pounds. He had not bathed in many, many months. His hair was long. His face was covered kind of with soot from his wood-burning stove. He had this kind of gazed look as he's being led along between two federal marshals. You know, we've seen these kind of images before. But as Mom and I are looking, you know, our hearts are jumping out of our chest. You know, we still love him no matter what he might have done, and yet the rest of the world is looking at this same, not seeing a brother, not seeing a son, but seeing a monster, the person who killed those people. A little while later, I heard like a lot of commotion outside. Mom's apartment was on the second floor. I remember looking out, and it was like a dam had burst. The media trucks are all rolling in, and people are jumping out and, you know, pointing cameras up at the window, and I closed the drapes. And I'm thinking, I guess I was naive about the media, but I was thinking, why are they here? We received a promise, a solemn promise, that nobody would ever know that we turned in our family member. Now, you guys know about confidentiality. I thought the FBI would have a tremendous interest in preserving the anonymity of witnesses. You know, forget it, you know. I think it was Dan Rather, and this was painful, just the way it was expressed on the evening news, saying, well, you know, we have an interesting sidelight to this story. Apparently, Kaczynski was turned in by his own brother, David. Except he didn't say turned in, he said fingered by his own brother, David. You know, almost like a mafia term or something. And we ended up having our house surrounded for almost 2 weeks by media. You know, it was so strange to be sort of the focus of the world media's interest and at the same time feel so isolated. It was hard to see any horizon beyond this moment, to imagine that we could ever recover any kind of normalcy in our lives. I guess the worst thing we found out, I suppose, was that there was no doubt that Ted was the person responsible, and the most chilling piece of evidence they found in his cabin was another live bomb under his bed, apparently ready to be mailed to someone. If there was any, you know, I guess at that point, you know, we thank God that we had made the decision we'd made. Otherwise, we'd have had to live with somebody else's death. The trial had all this sort of stuff. You know, we went 2 years before the trial took place. It was kind of 2 years of hell. At one point I felt like I wanted to preserve what was left of our privacy, and then, you know, the lawyers basically said, David, if you want to save your brother's life, you got to go out there. You got to tell his story. You got to let people know that he's mentally ill. You've got to tell it. You've got to remind people that his family played a role in his arrest in stopping the violence. And so even Mom, who was most reluctant, there she was with 60 Minutes and Mike Wallace answering these difficult questions, again, bravely advocating for her son. And of course, all this stuff in the, is he crazy? Is he bad? Mad or bad? Mad or bad? You know, it's like we conflate the two. We don't know how to separate the two. Maybe we don't authentically know how to separate the two, but, you know, to have the notion of punishment, particularly capital punishment, trump any sort of the human considerations of causality here was very disturbing to me.
When did you meet your brother? Does he know that you turned me?
Yeah, you know, he certainly found out pretty quickly. I heard a story from one of the lawyers that my brother was very surprised to have been caught. Like, this was within the second day after his arrest, and he said to the lawyer, how did they ever catch me? And the lawyer said, well, didn't you know your brother turned you in? And this was heartrending for me to hear. He said, oh no, David would never do that. David loves me. And they had like a discussion back and forth because, you know, Ted was always very sure of himself, and the attorney actually went out and got a copy of the New York Times and showed it to him, and at that point, you know, I guess he felt deeply betrayed. Mom and I had rented an apartment in Sacramento, California for the duration of the trial. We thought it would be a long trial. It ended up being very short. Ted actually asked the judge on the first day of the trial for permission to fire his attorneys. And the reason was this. You could say it was stigma, it was his delusion, some combination of the two, but for Ted it was a fate worse than death to be described, as he put it, as a lunatic in open court. As you know, many people with schizophrenia do not know that they're ill. Ted was deeply invested in whatever sort of thought processes were involved in his actions. He actually made an attempt, and this was one of the most, probably the worst moment of my life, was when at one point some of the paralegals on the case dropped by our apartment and sat us down and very gently told us that Ted had tried to kill himself in his prison cell. He said he could not endure a trial in which he would be described as crazy. And so here we are. Our only hope is that maybe we could save his life. And the only hope, you know, at this point, that was the one thing Ted didn't want. His only way out of this was to kill himself. There was a lot of media pressure. We think of our courts having this sort of like this purely, well, they're influenced by lots of thematics that go on outside. There were a lot of editorials in newspapers saying, the man has a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was turned in by his family member. This is a case, if any, deserves mercy. And in the end, the Justice Department did offer a plea bargain for life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Ted took it, not to save his life, but to avoid the trial, which he said he couldn't endure. And for us, it was almost like this incredible sense of relief, no joy, but sense of relief that we weren't going to have to go through this process for years and years and years, leading perhaps to an execution at some point. But on that day when Mom and I had learned in court that Ted had accepted the plea bargain, that it was over, we were just kind of sitting there quietly in the apartment when the telephone rang in the evening. And it turned out there was a chaplain. She identified herself as someone who worked with law enforcement in Sacramento, California, where the trial took place. And she said she was calling because a family of somebody who had been killed by my brother was very interested in meeting with us. I'm trying to protect Mom, not really giving her the credit for the strength and courage she had. I said, Mom, you know, they've just learned this day that the Ted who killed their loved one is probably going to die a natural death in prison. They could be very, very angry. I think, you know, I'll go. I need to go, and if they're asking to meet with us, but I think you should stay home. I don't think you should have to deal with this. And Mom said, oh, David, how could I say no if they want to meet me? How could I say no? I also think she probably wanted to sort of support me as well. At any rate, the chaplain came and picked us up, drove us back to the federal courthouse building. At this point, it's, you know, during the day it was like alive, a buzz with media. Now it's a very quiet building. She takes us up in an elevator, walks us down a hallway, and as she ushers Mom and me into this room. We walk in there, and we see that there are 5 chairs in the middle of the room arranged in a circle. 2 of them are empty, obviously waiting for Mom and me to sit down. But the other 3 chairs had the widow of a man my brother had killed with a bomb, her sister, and her late husband's sister. So as Mom and I walk in, there's really only one thing we could be saying, which is, we're sorry, we're so sorry. I saw Mom crying a little bit, and I have to say, even to us, those words, we're so sorry, sounded hollow. I guess because they were just words. You know, they couldn't undo any of the harm that our family member had done. And as we sat down, I was almost kind of bracing myself for the blast of anger that I expected. And then the widow spoke. She explained that why she had invited us there. And she said, we discussed this between ourselves during the trial. Not everybody in our family wants to be here, but we decided that if there was ever an opportunity, we wanted to thank you in person for what you did, turning in your brother, your son. She said she couldn't imagine anything more painful. And I'm thinking, I can't imagine anything more painful than, losing your loved one to a maniac's bomb. And it just seemed like so incredibly gracious after all she'd been through. And here is this family thanking us. And we all were crying pretty quickly. We stood up, we hugged each other. I was in therapy. Believe me, I needed to be in therapy, and it did me good stead. And we had many friends and family members who surrounded us to support us, but no encounter, no interaction I had with any human being was as meaningful to me as this opportunity to meet the victim's family. I guess for me it gave me a little bit of promise that in this sort of torn world, wounded by violence, shattered by violence, maybe there was some opportunity for healing. I mean, maybe there was a future in which, the damage could be healed. And Mom, I think, probably made a mistake. But I think, it's clear we forgive her because she's a mother. There was one thing she wanted the family to know, and that was that her son was not an evil human being. Her son was very, very sick. She wanted them to understand that he wasn't a monster. So she began talking about mental illness. She began talking about schizophrenia. Mom had read a lot of books. She'd educated herself. She's talking about some of this. She talked a little bit about the hospital trauma. She talked about, what it was like as a mother to lose her son into these shadows and never be able to get him back. And as I happened to be looking into the faces of the victims while Mom's talking about mental illness, I realized they don't like what they're hearing. Mom was trying to tell them one thing. What they were hearing was somebody making excuses for the man who had murdered their loved one. I almost wished I could, somehow quietly tell Mom to change the subject, And then clearly Mom, I think, crossed the line. She said, it really wasn't my son we should be blaming. It's his illness. And at that moment, the widow just blurted out, I don't think she could contain herself. She said, he knew what he was doing. And all of a sudden, it was like the room was frozen in silence. It was like, we'd felt so close to this family, but now with Ted in the mix, the Grand Canyon is between us. And it's like, wow, we can see these distant figures, but wow, we're on almost different planets. And I was wishing, there'd just be some way to leave the room gracefully so that, we took the good and left the bad back there, left the hostility back there. Anyway, when the widow said that, Mom, I saw her kind of visibly hunched over, scrunch up, like she was a small woman anyway, but lower her head. And she said, I think what was clearly instinctively on her heart, she said, I really wish he had killed me instead of your husband. I think that's the truth. She would have gladly laid down her life to undo any of the harm Ted had done. But as Mom said that, I happened to be looking in the widow's face, and it changed, like the hardness that had been there softened. And then pretty soon her eyes started to well up with tears. She's a mother, too. She had 3 sons, And she got kind of thoughtful, and then I saw her very slowly get out of her chair. She knelt down on the ground right in front of Mom and put her hand up on Mom's shoulders, looked up in her face, and she said, Mrs. Kaczynski, you don't deserve any of this. None of this is your fault. Don't ever think for a moment this is your fault. We don't blame you. To me, it was a very powerful moment, with all that tension, and then to see it sort of trumped by this sort of grace and compassion suggested to me, like with so many conflicts in life, there's a better way. There's a way we can get beyond it, and it usually does involve compassion and understanding, and really understanding that we all hurt the same, we all bleed the same, we all love people, we all lose people. And for much of the advocacy and the work I've done since, it's been very important for me not to pit one side against another. That's not the answer. The answer is sort of collaboration and trying to work thoughtfully and with our hearts to find a better way forward. And most people have this, like the good heart that, surprisingly, on that occasion, this woman was able to show. This is sort of a poignant moment for me. Mom lived to be 94. She passed away 3 weeks ago. You know, and there's sad parts. I called the prison. Ted had no contact with the family over that time, and I just thought maybe he wants this last chance. And please don't let this leave the room necessarily. I don't want people to resent Ted, and I don't think you would, but I called the prison, spoke to the person designated as his counselor. She thought she could easily get him on the phone, and then ended up having to call me back, and he said that, you know, she said that he had decided he doesn't want to speak to her under any circumstances. I think one way to think of this is that, you know, Ted really is in two prisons. One is very obvious, it's the physical prison, but the more dire prison, the more painful prison really is this prison of mental illness. I don't blame him. Mom didn't blame him for his treatment of us. But it's a profound puzzle. You know, how can this happen? You know, I understand the diagnosis. I can see the pieces. I've talked to psychiatrists who say it's a classic case, and yet for me there's this unanswered question: what happened to Ted? You know, I really don't know. I guess the thing I would invite you to do, really, you know, when you see family members come and you see them upset, and I'm sure often they are upset. They're under a lot of stress. They're confused. They're probably feeling somewhat guilty, like they couldn't help their son or daughter, and maybe they're partly responsible on one level or another. What do we do? Sometimes we try to, what is it, displace blame? Is that, I don't know if displacement is what the technical term is, but you know, you guys are set up to be targets of hostility from some of these families because they don't want to be to blame. Well, it must be the hospital, it must be the institution, it must be the doctor. I think just it's so important to understand where we're coming from. We're coming from a place of really serious human hurt and trauma, and the folks wouldn't be showing up if they didn't feel on some level a deep human connection with their loved one, no matter what that loved one might have done. Probably many of them are here for having hurt family members. I'm just guessing. So it's all extremely, extremely complicated. We do know, as I said before, from research, there is a very strong body of research that says family interactions, as complicated, as even disruptive as they may seem, in general and in the longer range, are part of the treatment. And when people leave, often family may be an important part of their support system, a support system they're going to need when they get out. So thank you for listening to my story. I think it's, you know, I don't know if it's all that helpful for you. It's certainly helpful to me to be able to tell the story, to hope that it has some meaning. You know, the worst thing is that it's all just sort of meaningless, and people died, and Ted was lost, and Mom died brokenhearted. But you know, if we can create a sense of a mission about helping people and understanding the role of family in that help, that would make it somewhat easier to endure. I saw Ted only at the trial. He had actually insisted that to his lawyers that the family not be allowed. The lawyers actually wanted us there, but they also told Ted what was true, that we had a right to be there. So the only time I saw him after his arrest, he came in from a door behind the judge's bench, and he was almost walking down the aisle, almost straight toward Mom and me where we were sitting, but it was like his eyes were veiled. He didn't see anything. He kind of turned mechanically and sat down. It was as if he wanted us. I'm sure he must have seen us, but he didn't want to acknowledge us.
Guilt feeling about turning him in.
I don't know. I've lived long enough to feel like I'm not sure I know myself that well. There are things I don't quite. I discover things about myself from time to time. I don't think I feel guilty. I feel a tremendous sense of sadness of my brother's promise that was lost. A lot of our work against the death penalty has involved reaching out to murder victim family members, whether they're with us or against us, to try to show this isn't about, you know, the offender. It's really about all of us, that the death penalty isn't a good answer. And so I've really been sensitized over the years to the victim's experience as well. And I'm just very, very thankful there were no more victims.
Well, I have a question. When your brother left University of California at Berkeley, how over the course of years was he financially supported?
You know, at one point he wrote to me, a great deal of pride, and said, this is in the 70s, but still it's amazing that he had kept accounts for an entire year and been able to live on an average of 12 cents a day. So, you know, he and I both bought the property kind of outright, and it was fairly cheap back then. He had a garden, he hunted, he knew wild foods in the forest. He was extraordinarily disciplined. It was amazing that he was able to do this. But at some point, whatever, his savings ran out, and our parents just, I mean, they just sent, actually both of us, every birthday, every Christmas, they'd send us $500. That was like our birthday. And for Ted was able to save money on $1,000 a year was the way he lived.
Did they try to treat him after he was arrested? Did they try to treat him? Did they try to treat him?
Oh, was he treated at all? I don't know. In fact, when she was alive, Mom tried to call. He's in the federal maximum security prison in Florence, Colorado. Now, what we're told is that treatments are available in that institution. It's not an institution like this one. It's not designed as a treatment setting. I wish he were in a place like this. I think in a better world, he would have some like really committed, skillful counselor, doctor who would try to work around whatever that delusional structure is to see if he could get him to try something or you know, I have no idea. Ted is so resistant, it's hard for me to even imagine him ever popping a pill into his mouth because that was, you know, that was his fear. People are trying to take away from me my clear insight about the dangers of technology. But they always told my mom that they couldn't share any information, that Ted, as a federal prisoner, had a right to privacy, that he wasn't signing any releases, particularly not for his family, and couldn't tell. At one point, actually, Mom, you know, she can be I'm still using the present tense, I guess, but she could be pretty persistent, and she asked, well, can I talk to your supervisor? Can I talk to your supervisor? Actually got up to the warden of the federal ADX prison, and she kind of played her trump card at one point. She said, sir, do you have children? And he said, yes, ma'am, I do. And she says, you love them no matter what happens in life. Do you believe that? He says, yes, ma'am, I do believe that. And she said, well, look, I send my son letters. I've sent him some books for presents. I never hear anything back. Can you at least tell me if he's receiving those letters and books? And I think it was a little chink in the bureaucratic armor. Probably he shouldn't have even said this. So, but he said, well, ma'am, I could tell you this. I happened to be walking by your son's cell the other day. He looked to be in good health, and he was reading the book that you just mentioned. And for Mom, you know, everything's relative. But the idea that he would accept a gift from her, and that you know, she could do something, however little it might be, to lighten his load, meant a great. I mean, she was like walking on air for a little while. But basically, you know, the rules are, you know, if the inmate in this case doesn't want contact or information given to his family, none is given.
This is something I read in a book. I don't even know if it's been substantiated, but there was, I guess there was a report that your brother was involved in as one of the subjects of a psychological experiment at Harvard. And I don't remember the details of it, but I know it involved a lot of stress and humiliation. And I was just wondering if that, first of all, is that true? And if so, what's your opinion on what that might have, what effect that might have had on him with his vulnerabilities that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's really interesting. In the aftermath of the Cold War, there was a lot of thought that, you know, I think it was especially that there was a movie, The Manchurian Candidate, and I think there was thought that prisoners of war in Korea had come back and maybe had some mind control stuff done on them. So we were trying to catch up on our side. So the CIA actually had at one point hundreds of professors in colleges receiving salaries from the CIA without any public acknowledgement of that. The records of that whole period, I think there was a particular program called MK Ultra that involved experiments on unwitting human subjects. Some were in prison, some were in mental institutions, some were in elite universities like Harvard. We don't know for sure if Henry Murray, you probably recognize the name, his study of alienated young men at Harvard was an MK Ultra program. We're not 100% sure, but there's good possibility that it was. Murray had worked with the OSS during World War II, debriefing prisoners of war and trying to figure out which Nazis we wanted on our side and which we didn't. I guess maybe that's a flip way to put it, but the end result, the experiments that were performed, including the one on my brother, whether it was CIA funded or not, were unethical by today's standards. There was no informed consent, and there was clear potential for harm. It involved actually taking bright young men and attacking their values and philosophy of life through tactics that were not just intellectual debate, but personal humiliation and so forth. Years later, Ted's lawyer said, why did you even, he was in this study for 3 years, why didn't you quit? And so Ted, his answer was, well, I wanted to prove that they couldn't break me, that I could take it. So again, I think we're, I don't always tell that story because I don't think my message really is like, who can we blame for this? Was it the hospital? Was it this? Was it some family dynamics? Was it genetics? I don't know. I think it's a very complex mix that we don't completely understand. But if you look at the shape that Ted's delusions took, it could well be that those experiments at Harvard sort of shaped what that delusion would ultimately look like. Among the people he attacked were psychologists. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for the work that you do, most importantly. It's just, for families like mine, you can't believe how important and meaningful it is to us.